This video is going to show you how to make your Yamaha Zuma have both headlights on, both for high and low beams. My name's How To Bob, and I'm ready to get started. So to start out, we're going to take a piece of scrap metal, kind of thin, doesn't have to be anything special, and we're going to cut a piece of this metal about 3/8. It can be a little bit smaller than that, but 3/8 is a good guideline. We can adjust that later, so I'm going to mark it right here on my ruler, and then I'm just going to take a pair of regular old tin snips here, and I'm going to cut my metal. Now this metal that I have here, I've made several thousand of these headlight kits. This metal that I'm using here is a little bit thicker than it needs to be, and it's made out of stainless, but you can see it still cuts with the tin snips. And what I have here is a piece that's about 1.25 inches by 3/8. So I'm going to take the hammer and I'm going to pound it flat, because when you use the tin snips it kind of warps it, and I just like to have it nice and flat. Now that I have my flat piece of steel 3/8 by 1.25, I'm going to go ahead and punch a hole in the middle of one side. So I'm going to get my center punch and put a little dimple in it. Then I can clamp my piece of metal down to a piece of scrap wood that I have here. I'm just going to use a C-clamp and clamp that down. Now I have to take a drill. What I'm going to do is take a 1/8 inch drill and drill a hole right where I put the dimple in the piece of metal. Now this hole has to be big enough to fit the wire through, which I'll show you in a later step. And I found a 3/32 or a 1/8 inch drill seems to work the best. So now that I've got my hole through my piece, I can go ahead and take my piece off, and there's my hole. So now I'm going to take my snips again and just cut the corners off right around the hole, and that just makes it a lot smoother later on, and I'll show you where that comes into play. Now my next step is to put the piece of metal into a vise, and while I'm doing that, I'm going to file down the edges, and this is where I can adjust it. If it's too thick, I can make it a little bit thinner. I want to round off the ends, get any sharp edges off, and make sure that it's nice and smooth so it doesn't cause any damage to my scooter. And I'll go ahead, and you can see it's rounded off here. I'll go ahead and put it back in the vise now, and I'll file down the other side. Make sure you get the front, make sure the end is rounded. Okay, that should do it. Now you can see here, let's take this out of the vise, you can see the finished connector here. It's rounded on both ends, and there's a hole with the sides cut off. So now we're ready to start on the wiring. And for this you're going to need 16 gauge wire, and you'll need about 10 inches of it. So I'm going to measure out my 10 inches worth of wire and cut it. Now I prefer to use a green wire and a yellow wire, and that'll match up with the wiring in your scooter. That's the reason I do that, but you can use any wire you want. So once I get my 10 inches of wire cut here, I'm going to strip back about 1 inch or so of wire on each piece. And once I get that stripped back, I'm going to go ahead and twist my wires together, because I used stranded wire for this project. Okay, now that I have both my wires stripped and twisted, I'm going to get some flux. This is soldering flux, and what it does is help the solder adhere better. It cleans the metal. So I'm going to take my connector and I'm going to dip it in the flux and get a little bit of that on there, and then I'm going to take my wire and it's going to be dipped in the flux as well. Anything that I'm going to solder, I want to dip in the flux. Now I'm going to stick my wire through the hole that I drilled, about halfway through where I stripped it, and then I'm going to want to bend it over so that half the wire is on either side of the connector, as you can see here. Now I'm going to have to repeat the process for the other headlights. So I've got another connector here. I'm going to dip that in the flux, and I'm going to dip my wire in the flux and stick the wire through the hole and bend that wire over. And my next step, once I get this all set, will be to solder the wire to the connector. So at this point I'm ready to pull out my solder and my handy dandy soldering gun here. And what I'm going to do is just heat up the connector, and that will draw the solder into the wire and onto the connector, making it one solid piece. I want to make sure that I get it good and hot so that it makes a good connection, it stays together. I don't want my headlights flashing or anything coming loose while I'm riding my scooter. I can always feed in a little bit more solder to fill in the hole if it's a little bit oversized. Once I get that side done, I can go ahead and do the other side the same way as I did that side. Take the solder, heat up the connector with the gun, and feed the solder into it. And it will draw in, with that flux on there, it will draw in the solder into the wire and onto the connector. So I just want to make sure that it gets a good connection and that the solder is all the way around both sides of the connector and on the wire. Okay, now I'm going to take some heat shrink tubing and I'm going to cut off about an inch, maybe an inch and a half, 2 pieces about that long, one for each wire that I have, and I'm going to slide that over the wire. Now earlier we cut the corners off around the hole on the connector. You'll see why here. It makes it slide on a lot easier, and it makes the transition between the wire and the connector a whole lot smoother. And then once I get the heat shrink tubing on there, I can go ahead and heat that up, and it'll give it a nice professional look on my wire connectors for my dual headlights here. You'll notice that I left about 3/4 of an inch left without the heat shrink on it, and that should be plenty of room to make a good contact on our headlights later on. Okay, now that I have my 2 wires completed, I'm ready to start working on the scooter. So from the rider's position, you'll see 2 screws here, and these are Phillips screws. Those will be the first 2 that we need to remove. And once we get both of those screws removed, we go around to the front of the scooter, and there'll be 2 bolts, and you'll need a 10mm socket to remove both of these bolts. Now be careful because there is a washer that you want to hold on to. Okay, once we get these 2 bolts out, you want to carefully pull the headlight assembly away, and be careful because there's 2 wires going to the headlights. So we want to unplug these 2 wires, and that'll leave you with 2 pigtails here. And using a pair of scissors, you want to cut the cord wrap about 1 inch back so you expose the green and yellow wires. Now you're going to need 2 tap splices that will jumper the wires from the original harness, and what I did is put the green wire to the green wire and the yellow wire to the yellow wire, and that will leave us a modified pigtail. Now you'll notice that the factory wiring harness has an extra slot in it. That's where our homemade connector is going to go. You simply put that in and then slide it back onto the headlight itself, and then you can tuck the wires up out of the way and reassemble the headlight assembly. Once you get it back together, you'll have dual headlights. Now if you have any questions or you'd like one of my homemade kits, just send me a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. This is How To Bob. Thanks for watching.